Hello. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to our panelists, and thanks for everyone for braving the post-lunch slump. I know it's always tricky. I'm going to get out of your way and introduce the first speaker, who is Marcus Sautoy, author of The Creativity Code, a fantastic book available in all good bookstores, and also professor of maths at Oxford University. So come on up.
There's a lot of talk in society about this kind of dystopian future where we're not going to have any jobs because it's all being done by AI. But I think there is one area that most people feel is kind of protected because it's something uniquely human, which is creativity. But I think that what we'll see over the next hour is that even that is something that maybe AI will be able to achieve. And I think there was a real phase change I think the whole industry a few years ago with that famous story of the game of Go, where a piece of code was able to play at such a high level, a game which traditionally was thought of as a game which needed a lot of intuition, a lot of creativity, a lot of pattern recognition, and yet just down the road here, a piece of code which was produced to be able to play at a really high level. But I think it was more than just that, because I think that something really important happened in especially game 2 of this match against Lazard. Because there I think we see an example of one of the first cases of AI creativity. If you're a Go player, you get taught early on in the game to only play on the first 4 rows in from the edge. So Lazard was playing white, AlphaGo was playing black. Lazard played his move 36, went up to smoke a cigarette on the top of the hotel. AI doesn't need simulation from nicotine, and sat there, and then asked the human player to place a stone on the 5th row in, which I've circled with the little dots there. I watch this obsessively on YouTube because I think doing Go is a bit like doing maths, and if a computer could play Go, I was a bit worried it might be able to do maths, and a sort of existential crisis hit me. And what was interesting is the commentators at this moment all gasped, and they all said, wow, AlphaGo's made a huge mistake. You never play that move. It's a very weak move. Lazard will be able to win the game from this point on. As the game went on and more stones got put down, the territory began to build up from the lower right-hand corner, and it turned out that that move 37 was crucial for AlphaGo completely controlling this piece of territory and AlphaGo winning the second game. Now, for me, I think this passes 3 qualities of what I think should make a creative move. I was on a committee just recently at the Royal Society here in London with Demis Hassabis, who was one of the minds behind AlphaGo, but also a philosopher called Margaret Bowden. And she's been thinking for many years about what computers, or as she calls them, tin cans, might and might not be able to do. And she has quite a nice working definition of what she thinks creativity should be, which I think is quite useful just to have here for our panel about thinking about creativity. I think there are many different kind of definitions, and one can debate this, but let's just take this one, because I think it's quite a nice 3 qualities you should have in something that should be called creative. It should be novel. Well, computers can easily make new things. That's not difficult. And that's something we can objectively measure, that it is new. But it also should have the element of surprise. We should be taken somewhere into the new. And it also should have value. Now, surprise and value, of course, are very subjective things. So if AI is going to pass this test of creativity, it's got to learn what we find surprising, what we value. And of course, if we give it lots of data of things that we find surprising and have value, it may well be able to learn that and produce something that we as humans will recognize as creative. So I think that move 37 in game 2 is an example of something that was new, and it certainly was surprising because you got that gasp from all the commentators, and ultimately it had value. Very easy to judge value in a game because it wins you it or not. But when we move to more artistic realms of creativity, these things are harder to judge about surprise and value. I think for me what's exciting about this whole revolution is that we as humans have found optimal ways to do things. We thought there was an optimal way to play the game of Go, which I've called peak A. But what this AI has shown us is that that was actually what we mathematicians call a local maximum. We thought we were at the peak, but if we take a risk and go down the adaptive valley, we might find an even higher peak at peak B. And AlphaGo and AlphaZero has now taught us a new way to play this game. It's pushed us out of our comfort zone as Go players. I think we were behaving a little bit too much like machines, just following the same patterns that our Go master was. The AI has perhaps made us more creative as humans by showing us a new way to play this game. So this set me off on a kind of journey that I've been on for the last couple of years, which culminated in the publication of this new book about looking, well, if it can be creative in this very confined realm of a game, where else can it be creative? So there are copies of this in Blackwell's, which I'm happy to sign for you after. So I've been looking just at the lay of the land since that game of Go about different artistic realms and whether AI might be able to be creative in those realms. So we're going to hear a little bit about music. There's a lot about music in the book a little later on from Christine. The written word, very interesting. But I'm going to focus on the visual world because I think that that's where machine learning has really caused a phase change, that visual recognition software, something we thought AI couldn't do 5 years ago, is suddenly extremely successful. So how good is AI at producing interesting, creative visuals? Well, one of the first things is, can it match our own creativity? Can it understand what we think is great art and be able to do something similar? So here's I've got a couple of AI Art Turing Tests for you. So one of these is created by a human. One of these is created by artificial intelligence that took all of Rembrandt's paintings. So the human is Rembrandt, understood what makes Rembrandt so special, his use of light, his particular way he does a portrait, and by analysing all of that data was able to produce another version. So I actually did have a nice bit of tech that I was going to use, but of course at a tech conference you're told to do things very analog, so I'm going to use putting up your hand rather than voting on a phone or something. What you've got to do is put up your hand to identify which one you think is done by the AI. So put your hand up if you think that this one on the left is done by artificial intelligence. Okay, so quite a lot of votes for that one. Who thinks the one on the right has been done by artificial intelligence? Okay, so I say that was about a 2/3, third split. Who voted for this one being by the AI? Yes, what do you think makes that not human? It's very detailed. There's a signature, but if you were going to fake it, that's very, very, very canny of you. Okay, well, in fact, you are right. So this is the AI one, and this is the Rembrandt, the real Rembrandt. Interestingly, this was not just a 2D project, but of course, Rembrandt has a very 3D style, so this was actually 3D printed. They understood that. But, what's the point? We have great Rembrandts. That's not really AI being creative. That's AI doing pastiche. Certainly Jonathan Jones, my favourite art critic in The Guardian, who hates anything to do with AI, this is what he wrote about this project, the Rembrandt project. What a horrible, tasteless, insensitive and soulless travesty of all that is creative in human nature when technology is used for things it should never be used for. But frankly, anyone who wears a shirt like that, I do not trust as an art critic, But in some sense, he has a point. We don't need more Rembrandts. However, AI can give us, and machine learning can give us new perspectives on old art. And certainly, if you take someone like Jackson Pollock, a mathematical analysis of that has revealed things that makes a Jackson Pollock special in contrast to somebody just splattering paint around. But I think the fascinating thing is to try and push us into new realms of visual creativity. So one of the interesting projects that I saw in my journey in this book was the idea of a creative adversarial network. So 4 of these paintings are done by a human, 4 of these paintings are done by an AI, and now you've got to vote again. So put your hand up if you think that these 4 paintings on the left are done by artificial intelligence. So any votes for the ones on the left? Okay, who thinks the ones on the right are done by artificial intelligence? Okay, a lot going for the ones on the right. Why do you think those are given? What's giving that away for you as not human?
First of all, previously AI was on the left-hand side.
Okay, so I just read. So he said previously the AI was there, so probably as a mathematician I like symmetry, and so I will put this one on the right. So yes, I have to scramble that. Yes. So in fact, these are the AI ones, and I think yes, I have to do a coin flip, won't I, to really randomize it. Again, I think this is very detailed in comparison to these, which often gives these away as AI, the sort of level of complexity that's coming out here. But these were shown at Basel Art Fair, and nobody was told whether they were human or AI. They were just told they were artists. It turned out that these four, there was a much higher emotional response by people visiting the gallery from the four created by AI. And you might say, well, did they feel cheated when they were told it was by AI? I think many people do feel cheated because they feel like they're connecting with some kind of internal world of another human being. But in some ways, because this is learning on our art, it is actually expressing our own internal world through a different filter. So it's not surprising that that might have some emotional resonance. For me, this is interesting because this is not just one algorithm creating these, but two working against each other. So you have a creator algorithm which learns about the art of the past, learns about particular styles, becomes an art historian, but then is tasked with creating something which breaks those styles, which can't be classified. So it's got to go into the new, something which isn't recognizable as old art. But it can't go too far into something which isn't recognizably art. So it has these kind of two ends of the parameter spectrum that it's trying to hit. The discriminator algorithm is saying, okay, no, that's too much like a style I recognize already, or that's just not art, that's not going to be recognizable as something art that you call art. And I think what's nice is these two algorithms are working together, making choices, something often we don't get when a computer, you just press print and you get a splurge. There's still an algorithm saying this is worth putting forward, this is not. And I think this is actually how a lot of artists work, this kind of creative urge, but then the discriminator. So I like this as a role for creativity in AI, that you've got these algorithms very much mimicking the creative process in us as humans, where you try something out and then you judge it. You're kind of optimistic and pessimistic. So here's Paul Valéry, a French poet. It takes two to invent anything. The one makes up combinations, the other one chooses. But for me, the most interesting story I saw on my kind of journey looking at the visual world and AI, something which produced not particularly interesting art, kind of kitsch art, but I think is the point about art and creativity, which is if you give a Google image a picture, it will be able to tell you, for example, this is a string quartet I play with, that there are musical instruments here, 4 people, chairs. But what Google were interested in looking at is how is it seeing the world? It can identify, but what is it seeing in this picture? So it kind of reversed the whole process and said, whatever you see, just dial up and accentuate whatever is in there. So it would give it random pixels and just ask it what sort of interesting things are appearing. When I did this with our picture of our quartet, suddenly these weird animals started emerging. A car sort of emerged out of the 3 lower players in the strings. And you understand that AI has learned on lots of images of cars on the internet, animals, faces, eyes. And I think this is the powerful thing, because we can understand, using the art that AI creates, how AI sees the world. So, for example, a very famous case where it took just random pixels, it started to see dumbbells appearing inside these images, but the dumbbells always had arms attached to it. Why? Because it had only ever learned on images of dumbbells held by strong men and women. So it thought it was part of our anatomy. So we can start to sniff out some biases that are beginning to appear inside these algorithms, I think, by using the art and seeing how the art sees the world. And I think this is somehow the point of why do we create art? It's because we have perhaps a unique way of seeing the world. We have an internal world, an emotional world that we want to share with somebody else. But that's quite difficult to actually get inside each other's kind of conscious emotional worlds. And so I think that, in some ways, that case of seeing how AI looks at things, this is absolutely at the heart of Marshall McLuhan's idea that art is our distant early warning system that can always be relied on to tell the old culture what is going to happen to it next. But I think ultimately art is our way of solving the hard problem of consciousness, that we can't actually experience what it's like to be another human being. And so our art is an expression of that. And I think the interesting thing going forward is that AI, as it becomes more and more sophisticated, is starting to have an internal world already that we don't quite understand why it's making the decisions it is. It's finding it difficult after a machine learning process to articulate why it's making those decisions. It's almost got a subconscious world. And we need ways to kind of examine and test that and to see how it's thinking, whether there are these unusual biases that might be creeping in that we need to sniff out. So I think that, Wittgenstein once said that if a lion could speak, we're not going to be able to understand him, because he'll have a very different, or she'll have a very different way of seeing the world. If AI ever becomes conscious, and I think it probably will do, at some point this phone will suddenly go, iPhone think, therefore iPhone am, and I'll have to wonder whether it may be conscious. How are we ever going to know that? And I think it's a long time off, but the art that AI and the creativity, I would say probably our own creativity as humans, this is a conjecture, but it may well have started to appear at the same time as our own internal consciousness began to appear, maybe 40,000 years ago. So I think that our test of whether AI might one day become conscious will let creativity in the artistic world be absolutely key to trying to understand that. Thank you.
What a fantastic kickoff. I already have a billion questions to ask you later. Our next speaker is Christine Payne. Her origins are as physicist and pianist, one of the best combinations in my view. More recently, part of OpenAI and specifically MuseNet, which I believe we're going to hear more about now.
Thank you. That was a tough act to follow. That was great. So I'm excited to talk about MuseNet, which is a neural net generator that I've created, trained on, you know what, I think I don't have the clicker. Can I get that? Trained on the task of generating music, generating MIDI music in particular. Thank you. Mainly what I've been interested in with MuseNet is this ability to generate complicated pieces that wouldn't be possible by other rule-based systems. So, harmonies that are very complex, rhythms that are very complex, long-term structure, nuances like that. So I thought I would dive in by playing a few samples. This first is going to be asking MuseNet to create a violin piano sonata in the style of Beethoven. Structure. The voices talk back and forth to each other. I'm going to skip over instead to jazz. So again, here I haven't actually told MuseNet anything about the rhythm, any knowledge of timing, of knowing 4 beats in a measure, anything like that. This is all stuff that it had to learn from tons of examples of human pieces. So as I mentioned, I've been focused on MIDI music, which is an event-based music system. So I like to think of it more as focusing on the composition side of the problem. So MIDI will have things about what pitch it is, what instrument's playing, what the volume is, and the sort of timing between notes. But it doesn't have information that a sort of human performer would have, like the timbre of the note. You probably heard that the violin sounded awful in that sample. So like that sort of nuance is lost at this stage. I think the direction we're going is towards raw audio generation as well. But right now I've been really interested in this long-term music structure. So my approach to doing this is to imitate the way language generation is done. And right now, a lot of the cutting-edge language generation is done using a transformer architecture. So this is a neural net that's trained on an autoregressive task where you're giving it lots of data where it has to predict what the next word should be. So you're giving it tons of data that might look like, well, at first you just have to say, what word is this? And at this point, the net has very little to go on. Maybe knows that the is a likely way to begin a sentence or something like that, but it's got to have a pretty wide probability of options. As it has to predict the second token, though, like let's say now we tell it that the first word is hello, this has narrowed down the possibilities of what this next word could be. So now, once the model has been trained, it might come up with something like, 20% chance it's how, maybe 30% chance it's my, something like that. You can imagine certain words that are more likely to be here. And then as it's going on to the next word after that, now we're getting even more narrowed down. As the model has trained on a lot of these examples, it'll probably know by now that name is probably a good guess. Here we're pretty sure that, like, yeah, it's going to be is. So maybe we'll give it, a good model now would say 99% chance the next word is. Very slight chance there's some wild word that it's seen in some training data. And then again, we hit a point where it's a pretty broad set of options at this point. So like a good model will learn, you know, it's going to be a name here. It's probably not going to be a verb. It's not going to be a noun. So it'll have learned a lot of language structure to do this. But again, we hit a point where a generator could branch into a lot of different options. So once we have a model that has gotten very good at this training task, we can then flip it around and sample at each of these points. So sort of at that initial position, there were lots of different options. We could have gone in lots of ways. When we hit moments like the word is, it's fairly dictated. The model has to go in a certain way. But then again, at the question mark, the last one, we get lots of options. And then to dive in a little bit into the transformer architecture itself, the model that's learning to do this. Right now, text generation is done usually either with LSTMs, which is a recurrent network, or more often with transformer architecture, which is an attention basing. And so there's a bit of a trade-off here. The recurrent network, so you can kind of imagine here that each of these is a single word going into the model. And so given this first word, maybe hello, it needs to calculate, it'll have an embedding, a set of numbers that it's learned to represent that word. And then it'll decide what part of that word is important to keep on for this next decision as you're having to predict the next position. And at each moment, it has to make a decision of what information to keep and what information to forget. So the problem is, as you're getting into a long structure, by the time you're here, it's really pretty hard to look back to maybe what that first word was. As opposed to the transformer architecture, which is the one I'm using, which is more of an attention-based system. Here, at each point, each of these words is, we're calculating a key and a value for those positions. And then at this point here, we're calculating a query where you're looking to match which of these positions has useful information. And the really nice thing about this is that you can then decide, like, oh, actually that thing that I learned in the very beginning is really important. And as you might imagine in music, where we run into the case where a melody that you hear in the beginning doesn't show up again until much later in the piece, this is actually really valuable because you're able to look back over a long period of time and keep a coherent structure. So now we have to think about how, so we know that this sort of thing works well in language, but how do we translate this into music? And here, the choice of the encoding is actually super important. And I'm happy to talk more offline of all the different kinds of ways I've tried it. But I've ended up on a sort of imitating a MIDI notation where at each moment we're finding, like, this note turns on, that note turns on, you wait a certain amount of time, that note turns off, this note turns on. We're basically trying to balance so that we have a very expressive system, but you want it to be fairly condensed so that you don't want the model to have to predict longer than possible. And so you can kind of imagine going different degrees on this scale. So in one way, you might imagine, like, okay, let's just model only the pitches, right? So only consider the notes themselves. Maybe let's throw out information on how long the note lasts, or even the volume, things like that. So that might be your way of maximizing the long-term structure, but you lose some of the nuance of the music. Whereas you can go to the other extreme of just trying to dump in everything about the MIDI file itself. On that end, you sort of run into the model will forget, like some things that it sees randomly once, it'll forget to turn back off later, and you get some pretty wild music. It's also much easier for the model to just memorize pieces rather than to generalize and get the sort of more the sense of the music itself. So based on that, I've ended up on this sort of middle ground where all of my tokens look like this, where they're sort of the instrument, the volume, and then the note itself. So Based on that, this is Chopin. This is, if you take the beginning of Chopin Ballade, like it's all here. It really is. You can translate this back, and you get the nuances of what the pianist was playing, the volumes, everything like that. And so what the model is seeing, or the model is asked to train on, given that first token, what does it think the next token is going to be? What does it think the next token is going to be? And in order to be able to do that, it needs to learn the structure of the piece itself. It needs to learn some understanding of harmonies, of rhythm, all these things. But I like to think about the fact that really, like, any piece could be represented like this. So the space of possibilities that the generator could create are, especially in the beginning, very, very broad. And in some ways, it's just a matter of how are we going to train the network in the best way. So a main thing I've done with MuseNet is I've trained it on tons of different music. So with the idea that the more pieces it sees, it'll be able to generalize. So harmonies that it's learned in pop music will help it to understand harmonies in jazz, will help it to understand, you know, rhythms in Gershwin. Everything that you learn in one helps you with another one. So I thought I'd throw in another example. This is the model doing a bit of ragtime music. Very nice. All right. And then, so just a quick bit about the data itself. It's around 300,000 different MIDI files. I want to give a shout out in particular to Classical Archives and BitMIDI, who sent me their whole data collection. These are 20,000 and like 200,000 MIDI files. And also using the Maestro data set that Google produced. And then one of the most fun things has been I've been using MIDI files from modern composers. And so composers are able to have the model trained on their own music, and they get this experience of composing and interacting with the model trying to be them. And then lastly, a lot of MIDI that was scraped from online. And then in addition to that, I end up doing a ton of data augmentation. So as you can imagine, transposing the pieces up and down, switching volumes, switching instruments. This technique called mix-up, where you literally mash two pieces together, and you do maybe 5% of Bach and 95% of Lady Gaga or something like that. And the model has to figure out how to blend those two. And so in trying to help the model make sense of this huge diversity of styles, the thing I've done is always the data is starting with the composer. I have a token for that, and then it'll know the instruments to expect. And then it'll continue on with tokens that represent that particular piece. So that would be a Bach trio. This is Christmas guitar music, country music. The nice thing about this is then, as you want to generate music, you can ask the model to go in the particular style that you want to do. But the other fun thing is that, as you might hope, the model actually learns really interesting embeddings for these sort of initial composer tokens, because it's learned that knowing that it's Christmas and guitar is going to give it a lot of information for predicting these next tokens. So you can do fun things like do a T-SNE plot of the composer embeddings themselves. And here it's learned, for example, that all these French composers are really close together, as you might hope. There's another part of the graph where like jazz is close to blues. The composers just line up in really nice, interesting ways. And then the other fun thing you can do is you can give the model the wrong blend. So you can start it out with, say, expecting a piece by Bon Jovi with this quartet, but then instead give it the first notes of a Chopin nocturne. So here's the model trying to make sense of a prompt like this. Pretty Chopin-y right now. So I kind of love that it manages to keep the left-hand nocturne part and then kind of create a pretty plausible pop song out of this. This particular song goes on for 2 minutes or so, which I won't do now. There we Very good. Okay. And then last, I wanted to introduce our the Co-Composer tool, this sort of demo interface that we put up on the OpenAI blog along with MuseNet, with the idea that I'm very interested how, at this point, humans will be able to interact with the model. So on the one extreme, you just sort of hit go, the model just generates total pieces on its own. On the other extreme, you can imagine, like here, you get to choose the style that you're wanting to imitate, optionally an intro if you want to, and the instrumentation. And then what happens is the model will come back with 4 different options for how it thinks the piece should go. And you, as the co-composer, get to choose your favorite one and send the model back. It then generates options for how you want to do the next section. You can listen through those, pick your favorite one, and then continue the piece and kind of continue indefinitely like this. And what I love about this is, like, I have always wished I were a composer, and I am awful. I really can't do it. But with this model, I have that sense that I can do it because even though I couldn't put the notes together myself, I'm able to say, like, oh, I like this combination. I think it needs to go in this direction. And I'm very excited about how this opens up the creative world of composing to non-musicians. And so lastly, kind of tying in with the panel, I just wanted to sort of say my own view of these different levels of creativity and sort of where I see MuseNet and then other models fitting in. So I think sort of at the basic level, we're thinking of this idea of mimicry, this idea that I'm trying to imitate a piece by Beethoven or a piece by Chopin. And yes, I think we can say it's derivative, although I also think that, if we can come up with a great, next symphony by Brahms or something like that, I think that, or, the new Beatles album or something like that, like, I think that will be already an interesting creative achievement. But then I see a next level as being taking 2 totally different styles and then mashing them together. And then maybe a step beyond that being, like, are there ways that we can get to totally new styles? Maybe we have to take MuseNet and train it on, like, what humans like rather than what humans have already done. But finally, I see this level of creativity that maybe for now is uniquely human, this idea that here are the limits of what we are expecting, and let's see if we can totally step outside them. So I know, like, in the piano world, whoever thought first, like, oh, we don't only have to play the keys, we can reach in and pluck the strings inside the piano, or, we can bend notes, use instruments in wildly different ways. And, to me, that would mean, like, I've defined a lot of what MuseNet can do based on the tokens that I'm giving it, but to come up with AI creativity that could sort of recognize these are the limits you've given me, but I want to step outside of them. That's where I think maybe the ultimate level of creativity is. But thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Christine. As someone who spent about 30 years trying to train my musical data set, that was truly depressing, so thanks very much. Our final speaker is Julian Nolan, CEO and founder of Iprova, who is going to be talking a little bit about how we can use AI for inventing. So here we go.
So we had 2 great talks there, and I hope I can follow on from those 2. I think when a lot of us think about creativity, we do think about music, we think about literature, we think about the kinds of things that we've been discussing so far. But as an engineer, when I think about creativity, I also think about invention. And when I prepared for this talk, I did a Google search on musicians, and then I did a Google search on inventors, maybe to get some images. That's quite shocking, actually. The images that you get back for inventors are almost all in black and white, while musicians are in full color. And I don't really want to dive into detail on this, but the point I'd like to make here is that I think the way inventions are created hasn't changed for a very long time. Actually, in many cases, I would say, well over 100 years, matching the black and white nature of the photographs. And so what we're trying to do at Iprova is trying to reinvent invention. So we're trying to bring a data-driven approach so we can invent faster and with a greater level of disruptiveness than previously possible. Now, what we're not doing is to create inventions in an automated way. So today, we use data and algorithms like NLP, graph theory, et cetera, embeddings to augment the human ability to create inventions. So our human inventors can invent faster and with a greater level of disruptiveness. Now, what I'd like to do today, I'll talk you through, first of all, why inventions worked fine for 100 years or more, actually for a lot longer than that. Why would you want to change it now? Why is now a good time to have a data-driven approach to invention? So I'll talk you through why that's the case, and then I'll explain how our technology works. But what I'd like to do to begin with is talk you through an example invention, just so we all have an understanding of what an invention is. Now, this invention has 3 elements. So when I think of inventing, actually I always think of it a bit like cooking. So for me, inventing really is like cooking. You have ingredients, and then you have a recipe that goes around the ingredients where the magic kind of inventive spark is, which results in the invention. So I'll explain this a bit like I was cooking. So this invention, you have a piece of research that was carried out by a university in the US a few years ago. And this research found out, very surprisingly, that humans have got light-sensitive proteins in their ear. So what that means is, if you shine a light in your ear, it has the same biological effect as observing light through your eyes. Now, of course, you cannot see through your ears, but it does mean to say, if you shine a light in your ear, it influences your body clock or your circadian rhythm. That's the first ingredient of this invention. The second ingredient is that there are various medical conditions like seasonal affective disorder, which are caused by a biological lack of light. So if you live in, I don't know, Scandinavia or somewhere where it's dark for much of the winter, some people feel depressed because it's dark, and that's seasonal affective disorder. So that's the second ingredient. Now, the third ingredient, imagine that you're a company, maybe like Philips, for example. You make headphones, you also have a lighting business, and you have a healthcare business. Maybe you can start to guess the invention here. So the invention here is that you integrate lighting elements, could be an LED or fiber optic, in a pair of headphones, so you can apply a light treatment as someone's listening to music. Maybe they're commuting to work, maybe they're at work, at home, and that's much more convenient than the traditional treatment for seasonal affective disorder, which is to typically go into a room full of bright lights of a certain wavelength for some hours every day. And of course, that may be convenient for some people and may not be convenient. But if you know you can apply a light treatment through the ears in the context of a pre-existing medical condition and the light naturally entering the eyes, that gives you a great alternative way of treating medical conditions like seasonal affective disorder. So this is the example invention. And now I'd like to move on to take a look at why change invention now? Why is it a good time to have a data-driven approach? And the reason is that if you think about the way inventions come about, it's based actually on human serendipity, human good luck. And very often, the way a lot of inventions are created is that someone will find out about something new. Okay, so you find out about something new, you apply it in your area of expertise, and you have that magic inventive moment where you come up with the great invention. But if you think about it, that's really suboptimal. And it's suboptimal in at least 2 ways. First of all, maybe you've learnt this new thing when you go for a coffee, or you come to a conference like CogX, or you go to a brainstorm in your company. And of course, the timing of that doesn't coincide with when the information first became available. So you might talk to a colleague over a coffee, find out something new, applied in your area. But that information might have been available for many weeks, months, or even years, meaning that there's a big latency between when the information's first become available, when you've learnt about it, and when you've used it to create an invention in your area. So in our view, invention as it occurs today is first of all suboptimal in terms of its timing. Secondly, we also believe it's suboptimal in terms of its diversity. So who's to say that you couldn't have found out about something even better that would have resulted in an even better invention? And so, and clearly, you're here at a machine learning conference, but who's to say you couldn't learn something even more relevant to you, maybe at a conference on human biology, for example. And of course, it's impossible for any one person to go to all the possible conferences, to learn all the possible information in a time-optimal way. And so for us, that means that inventions typically occur more slowly than they should, and also with less kind of what you could call information diversity, which then reduces the level of disruptiveness of the subsequent inventions. Now, in addition to that, there's also a growing convergence between previously unrelated products. And of course, everyone knows mobile phone is a very good example of this. But today, every product category is starting to converge against every other product category. And if you take mobile phone, this is an example we're all familiar with today, but if you take, for example, an autonomous vehicle, this will take convergence onto the next level. So imagine, it's easy to imagine convergence between fitness and an autonomous vehicle. So, for example, you take your autonomous vehicle home, the autonomous vehicle detects that you've not met your fitness objective for the day and refuses to take you home and drops you off some distance from your home so you can walk the rest of the way. Maybe that's not a great scenario, but you can also have convergence between autonomous vehicles and healthcare, for example. So imagine the movement of the autonomous vehicle, of course, moves your body. The autonomous vehicle has an ability to monitor your movement in response to its movement, and by doing so, to diagnose your core balance. Now, your core balance can be used to diagnose various neurological disorders like multiple sclerosis. So now you have the opportunity of actually having a health check whilst you take the autonomous vehicle. So you can see that in the future, there's huge convergence between previously unrelated product categories in an even greater way than there is today. And of course, if let's say you're an engineer, you're working on a control system for an autonomous vehicle, how can you ever know about all of the advances or all of the information in other areas that may be relevant to creating an invention in your field? Now, so what we're trying to do is to solve that problem. And one of the things that helps us solve the problem is that in our view, inventions are not the product of unique individual genius, much rather they're the inevitable consequence of a set of social, market, and technological circumstances. Now, this might sound unlikely, but if you look back through history, there are huge numbers of examples of the inevitability of invention. So let's take one, the CT scanner. So CT scanner was invented by Godfrey Hounsfield, working for EMI Music back in the 60s. And at the same time, someone called McCormack completely independently made the same invention in the US. Both Hounsfield and McCormack shared the Nobel Prize, but it was EMI that received the patents for that invention, as Hounsfield's invention was slightly earlier. And actually, once you start looking for the inevitability of invention and other examples, there are numerous. So there are many claimants to have made the inkjet printer, the transistor, and even the light bulb. So historians claim over 20 different people completely independently invented the light bulb at the same time. Now, what this tells us from an invention point of view is that from a population of people, there will be a number of people who are suitably qualified and with suitable background knowledge who can come up with very, very similar inventions given access to the right information at the right time. So what we do with our technology, it's all about giving our inventors access to the right information at the right time. So given the inevitability of an invention, they can be best placed to create the right invention at the right time. Now, the way our technology works is what we do, we model the area where we'd like to create inventions in. So we form a very, very detailed model. And then we look for things that are happening around the world that are converging against the model in a certain sense. Now, what we're not doing, we're not interested in things that are very close to the area where we want to create inventions. We want things that are very, very distant. And of course, this is technically very difficult. So normally, a lot of technology is very good at identifying things that are in close proximity to an area, but identifying things that are maybe very, very distant, but have some underlying inventive connection is actually extremely difficult. And so this is what we've spent many years researching, and this is really at the heart of how we bring together the ingredients that help us to create the inventions that we come up with. And what we're trying to do is to really look extremely broadly and then understand which advance or which advances may be relevant to an area. And then we have what we call the invention logic, which is really our understanding of, if you like, the science of invention, where we use that then to combine pieces of information to help our human inventors invent in a faster and more disruptive way. Now, maybe I'm coming to the end of the presentation, but maybe at the end, what I'll do is to talk you through one more example invention. So this also has 3 ingredients. So the first ingredient is that mobile phones are getting thinner. Of course, everyone knows that. Now, as the mobile phones are getting thinner, on a flat surface, they're becoming more and more difficult to pick up. So this is the first ingredient of the invention. The second ingredient is that today, mobile phones typically have a wireless charging capability. So that means you have a coil of copper wire in the phone, and you also have a coil of copper wire in the charging mat. Okay? That's the second ingredient. The third ingredient is that, of course, today, a mobile phone also has a proximity sensor. So when you hold it to your ear, it doesn't turn off. So imagine that you've got your mobile phone, it's on the charging mat, you reach to grasp the phone. Just at the moment you're about to grasp it, the phone detects the proximity of your hand, and power is applied from the battery through the wireless charging coil, so using it in reverse, okay? That turns the charging coil into an electromagnet, which then slightly levitates the phone above the charging mat, not by much, but by a little bit, making the phone easier to pick up. So this solves an emerging problem in a value-creating way by repurposing the existing components for an unexpected purpose, and is a good example of the kind of inventions that we create. So we try to create inventions that have got the same creative properties that Marcus mentioned earlier. So we try to create inventions that are, of course, new. If you're second, you're too late, actually, when it comes to invention. So we try to create inventions that are new, surprising, and also valuable. And in addition, we also strive to create inventions that have a certain elegance to them as well. So just to finish the presentation, so today, Iprova has created thousands of inventions, and it's these inventions that give us the training data to utilize the different machine learning and NLP technologies that we're using. Hundreds of patents have been filed based on our inventions by our customers. And actually it says 9 here, but I learned yesterday it's actually 10 out of 10 of the world's largest companies reference our inventions. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Julian. Can I invite the rest of our panel up? Only yet? All right. I could talk about this for hours, and I've been told we have about 10 minutes. So, only yet, let's get excited. Let's dive straight in. I think my first question, I'm going to direct it at Marcus, but I think most of you can jump in on it. How special really is the human brain? I mean, I'm a creative. I like to think of myself as very important and unique and special. But are we all just fleshy, data-gathering machines? Are we different? What's your view?
I think that, basically we know that there's some sort of if-then process going on, which is very algorithmic. It's so complex that there's no point sort of unpicking it and trying to write the code out. And I think that's why machine learning is interesting, because you're not writing the code, you're getting it to experience the data, a bit like a child exposed. You fail, you learn from your failure, and you then adapt. So it's got a similar learning process to machine learning and the human. Where I think there's a big difference, and this is actually borne out the visual world was very successful creatively, and the music as well, because there's a lot of pattern recognition. It was the written word where actually AI, I think, is actually having a lot of difficulty. Even though, you know, OpenAI has produced its weapons-grade text generation, a human has to be exposed to very little data in language to be able to talk. And this is not, Noam Chomsky believes that our brain becomes hardwired for language. And if that is the case, and we have to go through, you know, millions of years of evolution to develop that skill, then I think that might be a real problem for AI, that actually it's data, it just isn't enough, processing power isn't enough. There needs to be some clever thought and analysis about how to do this. And I think that might be where that AI will need to go through a process of evolution which can be speeded up, but that there needs to be a similar sort of process to what's produced the human brain.
Great. I mean, you talked a little bit there about the creativity coming from a source of communication and language. I guess more of a question for Christine. There's a lot of data out there about the value of art being in communication of intent. And when you look at the data between the enjoyment of a piece of art or music when you know that it's been created by an AI versus a human being vastly inferior. Do you think that that's a core component of creativity, that idea of communication or intent, or is that just a cultural idea that we're going to have to get over in the future?
Yeah, that's a good question. I do think that we romanticize a little bit this human creativity, like we feel like there's this magic inspiration that happens, or, you know, all the life experiences come together, which I think does happen, but I think there is also a lot of, like, we do the same, the patterns that we're following, or we have chord progressions that we learn make us sad, or colors that make us sad, things like that, that we've also learned those patterns in the way AI is doing. But yeah, I do think that a lot of art is about that connection from one person to the next. One way I do see this going is that maybe like a non-musician or non-artist can create a work of art, have the AI create a work that they feel, you know, it's super personalized, like this is my piece. And that could be my way of, and then when I share it with someone else, this is like a new way of me being expressive in a way that, since I'm not a composer, I couldn't do, or I'm not an artist, I can't do. So I do think that in some ways it's opening up human creativity, or that sort of connection can still be there. But yeah, I do think that's an issue that is part of why we love art, is that sort of familiarity of sharing between people.
I think that word you use, intent, is really important here, because I think in all of these examples, the intention is still coming from a human, although how the creativity is done may be still mysterious as it goes through some sort of filter. But I think, you know, where will that intent, some desire to express itself, come from AI? And I think that will only be when it wants to share its internal world in some way. So I think that word intent is absolutely tied up with the word consciousness.
Oh, that's actually my next question. Yeah, thanks for beating me to it. But yes, creativity is almost, it means it would look like historically anthropologically. It's a compulsion. It's a compulsion in our nature to want to express ourselves, to want to solve problems, to want to invent things. Do you think we'll ever be able to create an AI that is compelled to express itself in the same way? Your view is not until
I think it's going to take moving to consciousness, but I think that's not, that's a way off thing. The interesting thing is, how can we use this as a tool to stimulate our own consciousness? As I said, I think we behave too much like machines. We get stuck in patterns, and I think Christine, you outlined very nicely what I say in the book about 3 different sorts of creativity. Kind of exploratory creativity, pushing the limits of the system, which is, playing chess or Go. But then this combinational creativity, combining 2 different things. That's what I encourage my PhD students to do. Take something from a completely different area and see how it might inform your new look. The real challenge is this transformational creativity. How do you break outside the box? How do you create the square root of -1 if your system says that all numbers when you square them are positive? But I think you can program that, because you can program something to break the rules and see whether anything interesting happens out of that. So I think transformational creativity is something still AI will be able to do, but you just got to program it to break the rules.
I feel like I want to push back a little bit on the, it'll be a long way off before AI is motivated to create things, though, because I could imagine, in the world of the example of the Go, where you're training on the one AI system is playing against another one, you could imagine multi-agent systems, or creating some sort of game where Because a lot of our desire to communicate or create art is this like needing to create a social currency, a connection with others. And so if you're creating a game where there's a reward for persuading others to join your team or kind of bonding in a certain way, I could definitely imagine there being ways where the way to get to that is...
I still think that intent's coming originally from a human, though, to put that value in.
You mean we're creating the adversarial network in the first place, so we're introducing competition into the system?
Yeah, you tell the thing what it's going to value, and then, but, you know, to play a game.
Okay.
Why would it want to play a game?
Okay.
You see,
There is some original story.
Yeah, that intention to want to play a game is really, you know, why do we suddenly want to play a game?
Yeah.
I think that's very human, and, you know, the AI is being told to play the game.
Well, we're sort of told to do that by gather food and
Very
reproduce, right?
interesting,
Yeah.
Kind of moving on from that, but in the same vein, a question for Julian. We talked a bit about using AI as a kind of a co-collaborator, and that's definitely the premise of what you're doing at Iprova.
Yeah.
Specifically in invention and technology. We see it now more and more in art and music, and I mean, I talk a lot about a friend of mine called Reap Swan. I don't know if everyone's seen the Reap Swan beatboxing opponents AI system that he created. Is very cool. Check it out on YouTube if you don't. Do you think this idea of creating AI twins, AI collaborators is going to become more and more mainstream? Or do you think it's still pretty niche in what you're looking at?
I think so. I think having, you know, using AI to augment and magnify someone's ability to invent is something that we're already getting huge value from, and I see absolutely no reason why that wouldn't become more popular. I think another important point about that is that by working, you know, by having this kind of collaborative way of working with AI, we're able to generate a lot of training data, because every invention that we create, we get more training data so we can better train the AI, better refine the architectures that we're using. So it gives us a huge amount of intelligence. And actually, one of the problems we have in technical invention is that training data is quite sparse. So a lot of people think, hey, you can use patent data, but actually patents don't tell you how the invention was created. They describe the invention, but not how it was created. And we're very interested in how the invention was created. You know, what does the inventive spark actually look like? How can we get more information so we can maybe one day automate that?
You talk a little bit there about making sure the training data is big enough and making sure it's correct. I guess if we think about ourselves as these biological AI machines, we accept and reject various bits of data based on preference and culture and taste. Do you, I guess it's a question for everyone, do you think taste exists, or is it just trend from a data perspective? Just an easy one to throw out there.
Sure. I mean, I do think that there are, you know, that's part of what's so interesting is that each person, like, yes, we have overall trends that we're maybe nudged towards following, but I'm very certain that the art that I like is different from the art that you like, and we do have this sense of individual taste. Yeah, whether that's just shaped from what we were exposed to early, or if there's some like predisposition, I guess is open. But yeah, are you talking in terms of like how you then would shape training data with
can you
that?
train an AI to have taste?
I think it's going to start to have its own taste. I think that's what's interesting, this sort of independence, not creating things that we're interested in. It's going to start to want to create things that are interesting for each other. I mean, one of my favorite films is Her, where the AI, you know, is a relationship with a human and a piece of AI, but the AI finds the human so slow in its interactions that it goes off, you know, I can get to know somebody in sort of nanoseconds whilst you take so long to communicate. So that's the interesting thing with music. Some of the stories I saw, that the music that was being developed was starting to be very unembodied. And actually, I did a bit of work with Christine's AI for a project I did at the Barbican, where we created a Bach AI synthesized piece. When you listen to it, it's quite hard to see the joins, but when you play it, you could absolutely feel the moment when it was AI and not Bach, because it just wasn't interested in how the fingering happened. So I think, and it starts, there's a jazz improviser where it just, the complexity of the jazz is too much for the human ear. And so it's starting to push itself into new realms, which perhaps the AI will begin to appreciate with each other, because they can work at a different rate. It's like mountains probably have a completely different rate of engagement than humans, but they probably are engaging. And AI is going to be looking at us like a mountain, sort of just like, it's just not doing anything, hasn't moved yet.
I
That
mean,
is where I'm excited about the AI collaborating with humans rather than having two separate roads, because
Yes,
it'll be
yeah, yeah.
exciting to see humans kind of moving in that direction as well.
fascinating stuff. I think we're out of time. We will be carrying the conversation on, I think, outside.
Provided it's not raining.
I think it's looking all right.
It's not raining. No, definitely. That was amazing. Thank you, panel. So, there are, if you'd like to continue the conversation, there is a Meet the Speaker, and Tom over there has a, we decided it's pink, paddle. You can follow him, and there will be speakers there for discussion. And also, I think, Marcus, you have a book signing of your great book at the Blackwells, which is underneath the impact stage over there. So please just say thank you again to our fantastic panel.